I had always been drawn to the eerie and unexplained. It was a morbid curiosity that led me to the decaying ruins of the Tennessee State Prison, a place shrouded in legend and infamous for the supernatural occurrences that plagued its dark history. I had heard countless tales of the tormented souls that wandered its dimly lit corridors, and I knew that I had to experience it for myself. The day I arrived at the prison, the sky was overcast. The air was heavy with the scent of rust and decay, and a chilling wind seemed to whisper the secrets of the past into my ear. My heart raced as I pushed open the heavy, creaking gates and stepped into the prison yard. The prison's imposing Gothic architecture loomed before me, its ominous presence frightening. I was alone, save for the distant hum of the city and the haunting echoes of the past that resonated through the empty halls. I took a deep breath, tightened my grip on my flashlight, and ventured inside. The first thing that struck me was the darkness. It was as if the shadows themselves clung to the walls. My flashlight's feeble beam barely pierced the inky blackness, and every step echoed like a gunshot in the silence. I felt as if I had crossed a threshold into another world, one where time had stopped, but the anguish of the inmates lingered on. As I explored the labyrinthine maze of cells and corridors, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. Whispers and sighs seemed to emanate from the very walls, and the occasional flicker of movement in my peripheral vision made my heart pound. I was not alone here, and I knew it. The deeper I delved into the prison, the more the horrors of the past seemed to come alive. In one cell, I saw the flicker of a ghostly figure. A gaunt and haggard inmate, his eyes filled with despair. He reached out to me, and I could almost feel the icy grip of his spectral fingers on my arm. In another corridor, the sound of disembodied footsteps echoed, growing louder and closer with every passing moment. I turned to see nothing, but the footsteps continued as if an invisible entity was pursuing me. The most chilling encounter came when I reached the prison's infamous death row. I could feel the oppressive weight of the condemned souls that had spent their final days in those cells. As I walked past, I heard their final pleas, their desperate cries for mercy, and the sound of the electric chair crackling to life. It was as if time itself had folded, and I was witnessing their last moments, unable to look away from the horror. I knew I had to leave, but the prison seemed determined to keep me within its grasp. I retraced my steps, but the layout had changed. The once familiar corridors twisted and turned in on themselves like a malevolent puzzle designed to ensnare me. Panic set in as I realized I was lost, trapped in a nightmarish world where the walls bled with the anguish of the damned. As I stumbled through the prison's labyrinth, the ghostly apparitions became more aggressive. Their mournful wails turned to shrieks, and they reached out to me with clawed hands. It was as if they were trying to pull me into their realm, to join them in their eternal torment. I finally burst through the prison gates, gasping for breath, my heart pounding in my chest. The once overcast sky had cleared, and the warm embrace of the sun washed over me. The prison loomed behind me, silent and foreboding, as if it had never existed at all. I had survived the Tennessee State Prison, but I knew I would never be the same. The horrors I had witnessed and the evil presence that had enveloped me would haunt me for the rest of my days. The prison's dark secrets had etched themselves into my very soul. As the sun dipped below the rolling hills of Tennessee, casting eerie shadows across the landscape, I found myself standing at the gates of Loretta Lynn's ranch. My curiosity had led me to this fabled place, drawn by the promise of an otherworldly experience. The tales of the ranch being haunted by the ghosts of deceased Civil War soldiers and the restless spirit of a former owner had ignited my imagination. The air was heavy with a chilling breeze, and the whispers of the past seemed to cling to every blade of grass. I hesitated, but my yearning for the supernatural overcame my fear. With each creak of the rusted gate, I stepped onto the hallowed ground. The moment my foot touched the earth, I felt a deep sense of foreboding. The ranch stretched out before me, its old and weathered buildings seeming to moan in the wind. I was not alone, though. I could sense it, the presence of something otherworldly that watched and waited. My footsteps echoed through the empty corridors of the ranch house. Dust danced in the dim light that filtered through the windows, giving the impression of spectral beings flitting about. The stories had it that the spirit of a former owner, a cruel and despotic man, still lingered here, his evil-minded presence seeping into the very walls of the house. As I ventured deeper into the heart of the ranch, the legends of the Confederate soldiers buried here came to life. Their tormented souls, unable to rest in peace, seemed to rise from the ground, cloaked in tattered uniforms. They appeared as faint apparitions, but their hollow eyes betrayed their anguish. They whispered to me, their voices like faint echoes from the distant past, pleading for recognition and release. The air grew colder, and my breath misted before me as I passed the old barn. Inside, the air seemed to weigh me down, thick with the scent of hay and the musty remnants of forgotten livestock. Suddenly, I heard the unmistakable sound of ghostly boots marching in eerie unison. Turning, I glimpsed the phantoms of Confederate soldiers, their bayonets gleaming in the dim light. They marched with solemn purpose, as if reliving the horrors of the Civil War battle that had raged on this very ground. My heart raced and my legs trembled as I retreated from the spectral procession. I knew not if they meant harm, but their presence was enough to terrify the bravest of souls. The ranch had become a place where time had warped and the past and present collided. I took shelter in the ranch's chapel, its heavy wooden doors creaking shut behind me. Inside, I found the faint echoes of hymns sung long ago. The pews seemed to fill with invisible congregants, and a ghostly choir sang, their ethereal voices a haunting lament for the fallen soldiers buried on this accursed land. As the night deepened, I made my way to the cemetery where the Confederate soldiers rested. The tombstones were worn and weathered, their inscriptions barely legible. But as I approached, the ground beneath me quivered, and from the earth, the fallen soldiers clawed their way out. They stood before me, their faces contorted with agony, and they begged for release. My heart ached for them, but I could do nothing to aid their tortured souls. Desperation gripped me, and I fled the ranch, leaving behind the wailing spirits and the anguished cries of the lost souls. The legends had proven true, and Loretta Lynn's ranch was a place where the horrors of the Civil War had left a permanent scar on the land. It was a place where the living and the dead coexisted, and I had glimpsed the horrors of a bygone era that still haunted the ranch to this day. As I reached the gates, I cast one last look over my shoulder. The wind howled through the trees, and the ranch seemed to breathe with a life of its own, a life born of unspeakable tragedy. I vowed never to return, for the horrors of that night would forever haunt my dreams, and the ghosts of Loretta Lynn's ranch would forever remain etched in my memory. As I stood before the daunting entrance of the Bell Witch Cave in rural Tennessee, a chill came over me. The stories of this place had always intrigued me, but they had also terrified me. The cave was shrouded in legends of death, despair, and the paranormal. A place not for the faint of heart. Yet, curiosity had gotten the best of me, and I found myself there, peering into the darkness of that cursed place. The night was moonless, and the air was heavy with a damp, earthy smell. The looming trees around the cave entrance swayed eerily in the breeze, casting long, grotesque shadows. With every step I took closer to the cave's gaping maw, the feeling of dread grew stronger. Suddenly, a rustling sound echoed from within the cave. I froze in my tracks, straining my eyes to see into the abyss. What I witnessed sent a jolt of terror coursing through my veins. There, emerging from the shadows, was a creature like none I had ever seen. It was as though a twisted nightmare had taken form. Its eyes gleamed with malevolence, reflecting a ghastly, greenish light. The creature's body was a strange hybrid of man and beast, covered in matted, filthy fur, with elongated, clawed fingers that scraped against the cave's rocky floor. It moved with an unnatural, limping gait, a grotesque parody of life. As fear gripped me, I stumbled backward, but the creature, this unholy monstrosity, pursued me relentlessly. It let out a guttural, otherworldly howl that sent a shiver down my spine. I raced out of the cave, my heart pounding like a drum, but the creature remained hot on my heels, its fetid breath on my neck. Desperation drove me deeper into the woods, where the tangled trees seemed to reach for me with ghostly fingers. My breath was ragged, my limbs aching, but the creature was unrelenting. It was as if it were summoned by a supernatural force to torment me. And then, as I stumbled upon an old, crumbling cabin hidden deep in the woods, the air turned icy and a sinister presence seemed to envelop me. As I entered the cabin, my heart pounded louder than ever. The room was dimly lit by a flickering candle, and there, in the corner, I saw her, the evil spirit said to have tormented the Bell family. She wore a tattered, blood-stained dress, her eyes filled with hatred that pierced my very soul. With a voice like 1,000 anguished souls, she spoke. "You trespass on my domain, interloper." I couldn't move. Fear paralyzed me. "I didn't mean to intrude," I stammered. She let out a banshee-like wail, and the cabin seemed to close in around me. "You are forever cursed. You will never escape my grasp." With those words, I was thrust out of the cabin, back into the night. I ran, stumbling through the dense underbrush, the creature still in pursuit and the specter's chilling laughter echoing through the woods. It wasn't until I stepped off the Bell Witch Cave's property that the horrors finally ceased. The air felt less oppressive and the night was filled with the sounds of crickets and the rustling of leaves in the wind. But the memory of that night still haunts me, and I am convinced that I am forever cursed. That the spirit of the Bell Witch herself still reaches out to torment me from the shadows. The Bell Witch Cave is a place I will never visit again, for the curse of that night still lingers, and I fear that it always will. I had always been fascinated by the supernatural. So when I heard about the legend of Mary, the young girl who supposedly haunted the Orpheum Theater in Memphis, Tennessee, I couldn't resist the urge to investigate. The stories about her were spine-chilling, and I was determined to find out if there was any truth to them. One dark and stormy night, I found myself standing outside the Grand Orpheum Theater. Rain pelted the old, ornate building, and the flickering marquee lights cast eerie shadows on the wet sidewalks. A feeling of unease washed over me as I pushed open the creaky doors and the soft strains of a distant organ filled the air. I stepped into the dimly lit lobby, my heart pounding in my chest. I had heard tales of Mary's favorite seat in the balcony, so I made my way up a narrow, winding staircase that seemed to lead to the heavens. The wooden steps groaned beneath my feet as I climbed higher and higher, my flashlight cutting through the thick darkness. The sound of rain outside grew distant, replaced by the echoes of my own footsteps. As I reached the balcony, I saw it, a solitary, tattered red velvet seat in the far corner, bathed in an eerie, ghostly light. I approached it cautiously, my breath forming misty clouds in the chilly air. The seat looked as though it hadn't been touched in decades, yet it felt strangely warm when I reached out to touch it. My heart skipped a beat as I heard a soft giggle, like that of a mischievous child in the stillness of the balcony. My flashlight flickered, casting eerie shadows that danced along the cracked plaster walls. I turned, looking for the source of the sound, but there was nothing there. Just the empty seat and the oppressive silence of the theater. Feeling a shiver crawl down my spine, I took a step back, and that's when it happened. The grand doors leading to the balcony slammed shut with an echoing bang. Panic welled up inside me as I rushed to the doors, struggling to pry them open, but they remained stubbornly sealed. The temperature dropped drastically, and my breath hung in the air like a fog. My flashlight sputtered, its feeble beam casting erratic shadows that seemed to take on sinister forms. I was trapped, alone with the ghost of Mary in her favorite seat. In the darkness, I heard the faint sound of giggles again, closer this time, as if a child were playing just out of sight. My heart pounded as I realized that I was not alone. I stammered out, "Mary, is that you?" The laughter grew louder, echoing all around me. Suddenly, the seat in the corner began to shake violently, and the ghostly apparition of a young girl with long, dark hair appeared. She was dressed in a tattered, blood-stained dress, and her eyes glowed with a haunting light. It was Mary, and she looked as real as any living person. I stumbled backward, fear clutching at my throat. "Please, Mary, I mean no harm. I just wanted to know if you were here." Mary's spectral form slowly approached me, her feet hovering just above the ground. She reached out a translucent hand and brushed my cheek with an icy finger, her touch sending a shiver through my entire being. In a soft, melodic voice, she whispered, "I'm always here. I never left. Do you want to play with me?" I couldn't speak, terror rendering me speechless. Mary's giggles grew more eerie, and she began to float closer, her presence overwhelming. The lights above flickered wildly, casting her face in a ghastly, grotesque light. As I struggled to turn back on my flashlight, Mary giggled one last time as her form began distorting and fading away. The theater doors suddenly swung open, and the temperature returned to normal. I bolted out of the balcony, down the winding stairs, and out of the theater, leaving the haunting laughter of Mary far behind. The legend of the young girl who haunts the Orpheum Theater in Memphis was real, and I had witnessed it firsthand. I'll never forget the cold touch of her fingers or the chilling sound of her laughter. Mary may have played her tricks that night, but I had escaped her grasp, vowing never to return to that sinister place where the past and present intertwined in a nightmarish dance of the paranormal.